Here to dive into industry trends with leading ETF experts, this is ETF Spotlight with Nina Mishra.
Hello and welcome to ETF Spotlight. I'm your host Nina Mishra. Joining me today in the studio is Brad Longcar, CEO of Longcar Investments. Brad is a biotech expert and investor. He created the Longcar Cancer Immunotherapy Index and the China Biopharma Index. Brad is in Chicago to attend the annual meeting of ASCO, which is the American Society of Clinical Oncology. It is the largest meeting of cancer research in the world. Brad, welcome. Great to have you here in person.
Hey, Nina. Thank you. It's great to be in Chicago and great to be back here at Zacks. So thank you for having me.
Sure. So tell us about ASCO and why it is important. Tell us, how do you use ASCO as an investor?
Yes. So ASCO is what we call a medical meeting. So first of all, it technically has nothing to do with the stock market, although investors have an angle to this. But this is the largest conference of cancer research in the world. Every year, about 40,000 people from all over the world come here. And it really has a couple primary purposes. Number one, doctors attend this and they learn what new treatments are out and what are best practices for treating cancer patients. And number two, researchers and companies announce their trial results here. And because this is the largest and most prestigious medical meeting that deals with cancer research, companies tend to save their best, trial results and their most important ones and try to announce it here. And so that's why it's so important from an investor angle. You have a lot of public companies that are in the cancer research space, and a lot of them announce their trial results here, so that it can be quite stock moving. But also just in general, it's good for investors to talk to what we call key opinion leaders, the doctors who treat patients, and really get an understanding of what care is like today and what they think of new medicines and where they think the future is going. And all of that information helps us try to place bets and determine, what would be good investments in this field going forward.
Very interesting. So I read your comment in a recent interview about larger players like Merck and Bristol Myers taking a back seat to smaller biotech companies. And you mentioned that Amgen is probably the most exciting large biotech company this year. Talk to us about it.
That's right. So it's definitely a little bit of a change compared to the last 5 or 6 years. Usually it's those large companies that dominate this. And especially there's a new class of drugs we'll talk a lot about later called immunotherapy. So Merck has a big one called Keytruda. Bristol has a big one called Opdivo. And those drugs have really dominated this conference over the last 4, 5, or 6 years. And this year, it's kind of taken a little bit of a backseat, and it's really a lot of smaller companies that are doing things like cell therapies and what we call bispecific antibodies, and new technologies that are really the focus this year. And as a sign of that, one thing that's an interesting barometer, companies usually have analyst meetings. They usually take place on the Monday of the conference where, like a Merck or Bristol will get investors and sell-side analysts together in a room and go over all of the research that they're presenting here. And for the first year in many years, those two companies aren't doing that. So that's quite a change. But you mentioned Amgen. That's the one company, the one large biotech that's really standing out. And I think that's newsworthy because Amgen hasn't really been a leader in oncology for a long time. It's been many ASCOs since we've really talked about Amgen and been excited about them. And they have a couple really innovative, it's still early stage, but some really cool science going on this year. They have something called a platform called the BITE platform, which is what the technical term is T-cell engagers. And they also have another drug that's targeting something called KRAS that this industry has been working on literally for decades. And now Amgen is kind of the first company that has a drug that seems to look promising in this area. And so for the most part, the large companies are, a little bit quiet this year, but for the first time ever, we're really talking about Amgen in a big way. And I think that's a good sign. I think it says a lot about where they may be 2 or 3 years from now. They're not really following the herd, which is a good thing. They're conducting good science and they have some interesting trials going on. So good for them for, really doing good fundamental work and placing themselves, back in a leadership position for the first time in many years.
Okay, excellent. So let's discuss what's happening in the very promising area of immunotherapy, which basically harnesses the body's immune system to fight cancer cells. And we did an episode about a year back, which focused exclusively on immunotherapy and the ETF, your immunotherapy ETF. So for the benefit of listeners who did not listen to that podcast, could you tell us a little bit about what immunotherapy is, and also tell us about some of the important developments in the space and some related stocks?
Yeah, so this is one of the new very impactful ways of treating cancer. So, everyone knows traditional treatments like chemotherapy, and many of those work very well, but they can also be very toxic and affect the whole body. And the neat thing about immunotherapy is the immune system is natural. It can adapt and learn. And so the idea is if you can harness it to treat a disease like this, you might see stronger and longer lasting results. And this is something that people have been working on for decades and decades. And the first round of drugs really made it to the market 5 or 6 years ago. We're still in the very early stages of this. And one of the most important things that I try to tell people is that immunotherapy is not one thing. There's literally dozens of different approaches to this. So I mentioned those drugs, Keytruda and Opdivo. Those are the ones that are most popular. Like you might see TV commercials for those. Those are really foundational for types of cancers like melanoma and lung cancer and bladder cancer and kidney cancer and some others. So a lot of people have heard of those, but that's only one kind. There's something called CAR-T, which is a cellular immunotherapy. There's bispecific antibodies. There's Amgen's BITE program. There's so many interesting angles to this, and it's a brand new way of treating cancer, and we're just in the very early stages of, trying to help as many patients as possible and to get this to work in as many cancer types as possible.
Okay, yeah, I read recently that basically our immune system is very good at recognizing things that are different from our cells, and that includes mutated cells, cancer cells. And while traditional therapies like chemotherapies, they do not work very well for highly mutated cancers like lung cancer and melanoma, immunotherapy works very well in that area. And so could you tell us about some of the recent developments in that space?
That's right. That's a great observation. You're exactly right. So the immune system recognizes things that are most different. And so the cancers that it's working in well initially are the cancers that do have the most mutations and look different, from healthy tissue. So if you think about it, melanoma, what causes most melanoma? Sun damage. That has a lot, that creates a lot of mutations. That's the first thing that this really worked in. Lung cancer with smoking is the same thing. It has a lot of mutations. So that's working very well. And, the science is cool. Like these Keytruda and Opdivo's drugs are what's called checkpoint inhibitors. And, people have literally wondered for 100 years, like, well, why doesn't the immune system naturally attack cancer like it would, a virus or a bacteria or something that's foreign? And one reason it doesn't, that researchers have learned, is because a lot of cells and cancer cells have a protein on the outside of them called PD-L1. And that protein is essentially like a stop sign. So the immune cells are traveling throughout the body. they come up to that cancer cell and they see that stop sign and they just kind of turn away. And learning about that was a huge revelation, because what companies were able to do once they learned about that stop sign protein is they made drugs that inhibit that. So those drugs are called PD-1 inhibitors. And they don't actually attack the cancer itself. All they're doing is what we call taking the brakes off the immune system and allowing it to do what it would naturally do. So you asked about kind of, what's current things that are going on. So for the last 4 or 5 years, they took those drugs and kind of saw and learned like what types of cancers they work in on their own, what percentage of patients are responding to them. So we're kind of through like phase 1 of this. There's been a lot of work in that regard. And phase 2 is they're starting to combine them with other medicines. So other immunotherapies, chemotherapies, just anything, and trying to get them to work in more types of cancers and for more types of patients. And that's really where we are right now. So I kind of view that as, stage 2 of all of this. But again, as I said, immunotherapy is not one thing. That's only one kind. So one thing that's been very popular and very promising over the last couple of years is what's called CAR T. A lot of listeners might recognize that term. That's what's called a cellular immunotherapy. So companies are able to take a patient's own cells and reprogram them and infuse them back into the patient so that those cells are trained to better recognize and attack cancer. And that's working very well in certain types of blood cancers today. And that's the next step for those types of treatments is to try to get them to work in what we call solid tumors. So, lung cancers and kidney cancer and bladder cancer and things like that. So to increase their utility. So there's a lot of exciting things, and we'll learn, what the state of everything is over the next couple of days here at the conference.
Sure. So in your preview for the conference, you talked about some of the smaller companies doing some exciting work in this area, and that included Iovance Biotherapeutics. I do not know if I'm pronouncing it correctly.
You got it.
Macrogenics, and you also mentioned that Nectar was a big disappointment in ASCO last year. So can they turn it around? Tell us something about the work being done by these companies.
Sure. So let's start with Iovance. And this is important because the data presentations for this conference, most of them preliminarily are announced earlier in the month. So on May 15th, a lot of these trial results were already announced. And the biggest mover that day from a stock perspective was Iovance Biotherapeutics. And they're one of these companies doing cell therapies. And it's super interesting how this works. So when you have a cancer, immune cells actually naturally go to it and attack it. But especially for older patients and bad cancers, the immune system oftentimes is not strong enough. So what this company Iovance does is they take a biopsy of the tumor and they separate out the immune cells and they grow them by the billions and then reinfuse them so that there's like this gigantic army of what we call lymphocytes that have already, are already recognizing the tumor. So they're just kind of growing them and having more of them. And so they initially did this in melanoma. And the thing that was exciting at this conference is they did that process in cervical cancer. And this is what we call late stage advanced cervical cancer. So patients who are no longer responding to chemotherapy, sadly. And this is one type of cancer where, unfortunately, there hasn't been a lot of progress over the last, handful of years. And they did this process where they grew these immune cells outside the body and reinfused them back in patients. And 44% of women with advanced cervical cancer were responding to this treatment. So their tumors were shrinking. And there was just a drug approved last year for advanced cervical cancer, and it was approved based on only 14.5% of patients responding. So if this data holds up, it could be very important. It can fill a very important unmet need. And just a few days ago, the FDA announced what's called breakthrough therapy designation for this, which kind of is a good sign, really tells you that of its importance and will help the company develop this quicker. So that was a big mover, and we'll have to see updated data and more specifics of it at the conference itself. But I think that's an exciting one. Macrogenics has a drug called margetuximab, and this is for late-stage breast cancer, and specifically a type called HER2-positive breast cancer. And that's about 1/5 of breast cancer patients, so about 20% have that type. And this is for women who are no longer responding to other HER2 treatments. So there's a very famous drug that's was developed a long time ago called Herceptin. That was really one of the first targeted drugs that was, kind of ushered in the personalized medicine era. And that's been a great drug, and Roche is the company that commercializes that. And they've had a couple other HER2 treatments behind it. So this has been like a huge platform that Roche has been successful with. And for patients who are no longer responding to those treatments, Macrogenics did a phase 3 trial where they did this drug, margetuximab, which is very similar to Herceptin, but is optimized. So these are what's called monoclonal antibodies. And I don't want to get too geeky into the science, but a monoclonal antibody looks like a Y. There's like a stem and two arms. And what Macrogenics is doing is they're trying to make the stem better so that it interacts with the immune system a little better. And their hypothesis is that'll make this a better drug. So for these women that were no longer responding to those traditional treatments, they went head to head against this, really landmark historical drug, Herceptin, and showed that their drug margetuximab slowed the progression of the disease. And so that's very exciting that they might have built a better antibody. So we need to see more details of that at the conference, but that's another highlight for sure.
Very interesting. So the market for cancer treatment drugs is obviously very big. It's estimated to be about $123 billion globally. And obviously, it's very competitive. So there are many companies which are trying to boost their portfolio of cancer treatment drugs. I read in a recent Wall Street Journal article that AstraZeneca is now targeting early stages of the disease. So what are your thoughts on this approach of targeting early stage cancer? Because typically drug companies focus on developing drugs for advanced forms of the disease. And you mentioned about some of the treatments that target some of the cancers that have stopped responding to traditional treatments.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting approach. I saw that same Wall Street Journal article. Mm-hmm. Traditionally, these drugs are always, the ones I just described, you usually test them first in patients who have failed all other things. It's sometimes that's frustrating, like the immunotherapy approach, for example. We've always had this hypothesis that it should work better for people whose immune system is healthier and stronger. And so we've always hoped that these would get moved up into earlier lines of treatment faster than sometimes we'd like. And AstraZeneca, talked about that rather than for many drugs just starting in the late stages like that, they may go for earlier course of treatments. And I think that's smart. It served them very well in lung cancer. They were the first company to get for non-small cell lung cancer to get approved in what we call the third line setting. And that was a big market for them. And the way that the patients responded to that drug, which is called Imfinzi, was really amazing. And it kind of, I think, really shined a light on that hypothesis that we've all had all along, that healthier patients should respond much better to these drugs. Now, developing things in earlier stages is more difficult scientifically because it takes longer to do trials like that when you have healthier patients to get a signal whether your drug is slowing the course of the disease compared to another drug. That takes longer because a healthier patient, by definition, their disease is progressing, more slowly than a late stage patient. So it's not an easy thing to do. I give AstraZeneca a lot of credit for focusing in that way, and also from a commercial standpoint. I always give credit to companies that aren't following the herd.
Right.
And so, kudos to them for having like an outside the box idea. They have a new doctor there who's kind of running the programs, Dr. Baselga, and I think he's brought a fresh new way of thinking to the company that's going to serve them very well.
Very interesting. Yes, I read about him in that article. So what do you think about M&A in this space? Earlier this month, Merck announced the acquisition of cancer drug maker Peloton Therapeutics. Bristol Myers, which has a very good portfolio of immunotherapy drugs, I understand, that is buying Celgene for $74 billion. And Eli Lilly has acquired Loxo Oncology for about $8 billion.
Yeah. Well, like everything, each deal has its own unique rationale. So, like, for example, Bristol buying Celgene, one thing that's interesting about that is Bristol has always been the leader in this one type of immunotherapy that we call checkpoint inhibitors. They have this big drug, Opdivo, and they've really done nothing in the cell therapy space. And Celgene bought a big cell therapy company last year called Juno Therapeutics that's a leader in CAR T. So now Bristol will be able to supplement their checkpoint immunotherapy program with this cell therapy program and try to be a leader in both. So that's kind of the rationale there. And I think, biotech investors always predict that M&A is going to happen. So like, knock on wood, we'll have to see. But in general, with these new technologies that are coming around that like immunotherapy, cell therapy, things that focus on genomics, precision medicine, for the most part, it's really smaller entrepreneurial companies that are developing these things. Like decades ago, the scale of large pharmaceutical and large biotech companies really mattered because you had to do huge trials for traditional type drugs. But that's not really the case anymore. And a lot of them are being developed by smaller companies. And I am a big believer that the large companies have gotten a little sleepy over the last handful of years. They've been growing their revenue, doing artificial things like drug price increases and tax inversions and all of this nonsense. And I think they need to get back to basics and really develop new things that matter for patients. And they have to catch up. Like, you can't do that overnight. And so I do think a lot of large companies need to buy into some of these technologies, and the small companies are where that's at.
Okay, great. Let's talk a little bit about your ETF. It is called the Cancer Immunotherapy ETF, ticker symbol CNCR, very easy to remember. And I'm looking at the top holdings, and we discussed Iovance. That is one of your top holdings. Mirati Therapeutics, Fate Therapeutics, Macrogenics also, which we discussed recently. Bluebird Bio, Moderna. These are some of the top holdings in this ETF. Can you tell us a little bit more about this ETF and which companies you're watching as of now?
Yeah, so I'm the index provider for the ETF. That's my role. I create and design the index. And the idea is, this is a very difficult space to pick winners in. Picking individual biotech stocks is fraught with risk and volatility. And even this space specifically, immunotherapy, the reason I wanted to create an index and focus on it is because I think it's a very high impactful science and something that, is highly innovative and hopefully will be a growth area within biotech. So, 20 years ago, I viewed biotech as one thing. And today, I think there's high innovation, high growth areas, and I think there's low innovation, low growth areas. And I think more than ever, it's important to kind of pick and choose your spots. So I wanted to create an index that focuses on this immunotherapy space because, number one, I think it's important work for patients. And number two, I think it's really one of the best businesses to be in the biotech sector. And so I've created a basket of these companies. And as I've been describing today, this immunotherapy approach is not one thing. There's dozens of different ways to go about this. And even the experts don't know what's going to succeed and what's going to fail. Biology is very complicated and drug development is very risky, and you have to be diversified. And so since I'm, such a big fan and such a big believer in this immunotherapy space, I wanted to create a basket that aggregates the top companies together. And so our index currently has 25 companies. 5 of them are the large ones, like the Merck and Bristols that have the drugs on the market today. And then 20 are those biotech companies, those smaller entrepreneurial ones that are developing the second and third generation immunotherapies of all kinds, everything from cell therapies to bispecifics to, you name it. And so the idea is, rather than placing a risky bet on 1 or 2 companies, this will track the growth of the field in general.
Okay, great. And this is definitely a very interesting ETF. Now, I wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk about the policy issues. Healthcare is the worst performing sector this year, and that is thanks mainly to policy-related concerns. So what's your take on that? And do you think if there will be a big focus on policy-related issues at the ASCO conference?
Yeah, definitely. So, we've been talking about these things for many years, like drug price increases, and it's really starting to affect companies in a big way. The large companies, their earnings the last few quarters have been very mediocre, and the guidance is, has been worse than mediocre. So these things that we've been hearing about for many, many years are finally showing up in the numbers. And our healthcare system is going through big changes. We had the Affordable Care Act, and now that the political season is starting to heat up again, you're hearing terms like Medicare for all, and, every candidate has some big, transformational plan that they're trying to propose. And one thing that I think is very important is that all of this is backed up by real world evidence and data. And one of my biggest takeaways from the conference this year is I was going over the list of all what we call the abstracts. So all of the trial results and all of the research that's being presented here. One thing I noticed more than in the past is a lot of these have to do with policy, like the health outcomes for multiple myeloma patients after the Affordable Care Act. And I think that's a good thing because, science is not, when done right, is not political. And it's important if we're going to be making big changes to our healthcare system that it's not all about, politics and, people getting excited and passionate and making rash decisions that could really change the way that healthcare is practiced in our country going forward. I think it's important that it's backed up by real world evidence and data. And so I think that the research community and organizations like ASCO that host this play a big role in doing that type of research and presenting it to the public so that we can be armed with real information to better understand how changes that have happened in the past or even, proposals will actually affect patients and the people that care for them. So there's a lot of things being presented at the conference this year like that, and I think it's a good thing. The data and just the hard truth is a good thing, and hopefully it'll help us going forward. As we think about the the impact of some of these decisions that, politicians and others are talking about.
Sure. Makes a lot of sense. That's all we have time for today. Brad, thanks again for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks a lot for having me.
Thanks everyone for listening. If you want to learn more about Brad's research and the two indexes that he created, please visit longcarfunds.com. Make sure to tune in for the next episode of ETF Spotlight. If you have any comments or questions, please email podcast@zacks.com.
This material is being provided for informational purposes only, and nothing herein constitutes investment, legal, accounting, or tax advice, or a recommendation to buy, sell, or hold a security. Do not act or rely upon the information and advice given in this podcast without seeking the services of competent and professional legal, tax, or accounting counsel. Publication and distribution of this podcast is not intended to create, and the information contained herein does not constitute an attorney-client relationship. No recommendation or advice is being given as to whether any investment or strategy is suitable for a particular investor. It should not be assumed that any investments in securities, companies, sectors, or markets identified and described were or will be profitable. All information is current as of the date herein and is subject to change without notice. Any views or opinions expressed may not reflect those of Zacks Investment Research as a whole.